So barriers, this area is a lot more nuanced and take some time to pick apart. And don't worry about it for title abstract. Just be able to identify generally, same with disabilities, be able to identify generally that this is talking about disabilities and there's a barrier here. You do not yet need to be able to separate them into these categories, but eventually you will, so start paying attention to them. And what is a barrier? It's something that poses an obstacle, physical or otherwise, to completing or entering medical education. Disability itself, this is important, is never the barrier. Being a wheelchair user is not a barrier to completing medical education or entering medical education. Not having a ramp to your medical school, not having lab tables in anatomy lab that are low enough to see into a cadaver, those are barriers. The disability is not the barrier, it's not the cause of the struggle, it's the societal structures around you that are the cause. So keep that in mind, because that's what we are looking at, that's what we can change. We don't need to be contributing to the disability being a negative thing mindset. So we break barriers into 7 subtypes. We have accommodations, culture, which is the culture of medicine and medical providers, disability and student services, disability tax, environment, stigma and ableism, and policy. This is kind of a big map of everything that we could really think of that would entail a barrier. When you look at like these dark blue ones here, those are the only things you have to memorize, okay? I don't want you to memorize all of these things, basically. What this map is for is if you're like, okay, I don't really know if this falls under culture or stigma and ableism. You can look at this as like a reference of like, okay, what are some examples? And these are just a bunch of examples that you can look at to try to figure it out. So the medium blue and the light blue, you don't need to memorize. It's just a help tool. So our first barrier, accommodations. These are barriers that are relating to or implementing accommodations. So accommodation is just any adjustment or modification to a task, method, or environment to enable access to someone with a disability. So that can be extended time for testing, a ramp to get into a building, paratransit, extra sick time, so that you can go to your doctor's appointment. There are hundreds upon thousands of disability accommodations, and I can't list them all for you, but basically just like know that pattern of anything that helps someone engage and interact with their environment. The barriers that relate to this, you're going to see stuff like problem with consistency, timely application. So it's not really helpful for your school to get you magnifying glasses for anatomy lab if you have a visual impairment if they come after the second midterm's passed, right? Like you need those ideally before class starts, or like within the first week or so. A lot of schools struggle with providing, okay, what is the best fit accommodation? What can we give the student to help them succeed to their maximum capabilities versus what is the legal minimum? So like, it's the legal minimum to put a ramp next to the garbage in the back to get someone into a school. But the best fit would be if you put a ramp at every single entrance so that someone can come in and go as they please, just like anyone else could. And then flexibility. Things change in your environment. You don't know what you're going to need all the time, and assistive technology access. There's more than just this list, but these are just common examples. Culture of medicine. So these are barriers caused by the beliefs, norms, traditions, and attitudes that are common in medicine. Medicine as the culture that surrounds it. So the culture of doctors, of other medical providers that kind of exists in that realm. And what we see a lot is like when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, they might tack on disability to the end of the list, or they just might forget about it entirely. It's not super highly ranked. People don't see the importance of it. You get some of this bootstrap rhetoric, which is fancy words for like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, tough it out, the kind of rite of passage of those, let's do 48-hour on-call at the hospital all the time, kind of stressful tests that they put people through, the superhuman expectations of, being able to do all of this stuff, giving up sleeping and eating and, studying more hours in the day than you have time, and like suffering in silence. Like it's expected of everyone. Everyone's going through it, so why are you bringing it up? Like that kind of mindset. The association that people with disabilities are patients and not doctors, that's a pretty big one that you'll see. Undifferentiated medical student, so the expecting one medical student to be able to go into all possible specialties. It's not really realistic to ask a blind person to be a surgeon, right? But we don't really need them to be a surgeon because we don't actually expect all medical students to become surgeons. And then the inflexible one-size-fits-all, biased measurements. So like we know that the MCAT is a measurement tool, but is it perfectly reflective of who's going to be a good doctor? No. Why do we need to measure someone on their manual dexterity if they plan to go into psychiatry? Stuff like that. Cure culture, medical model, so this idea that disability is bad, that it needs to be fixed or cured. Not everyone wants it to be cured, and not everyone thinks their disability is bad. Lots of people perfectly fine with it like any other identity. And no pipeline programs. There are diversity-based pipeline programs, but there aren't any that exist for disability right now. And disability equals barrier rather than the environment equals the barrier. Disability services. This is similar to accommodations, but the distinction you're going to make here is they say the words disability services, or they're talking about the people who provide the service. It struggles in providing and accessing quality disability services. Providing, lab accommodations for a biology major is not the same thing as providing clinical accommodations for a medical student. It's a very specific, nuanced area that requires background knowledge, which is not something that most disability service providers have in their back pocket when they're just dealing with undergrads. So it's hard to find those people. How easy it is to access these services. Are they getting good advice, or is their advisor person just saying like, maybe you should consider a different career? That's not very good advice. Are they being gatekeepy? Do they want a ton of, documentation and proof? Restricted definition of disability. Disability tax. So this one, again, very nuanced, something you're just going to have to pick up. It's talking about these extra things or extra responsibilities or things that disabled people have to give up in order to just exist as medical students, medical providers. So if you think about disability, with that comes an inherent amount of extra self-care. You only get 24 hours in the day. You don't get that time back. And medical school isn't like, oh, that's okay, we'll just take off some of these stuff to balance the load. That doesn't happen. So there's higher expectations. A lot of people, even though they shouldn't have to, feel that they need to compensate or make up for their disability because there's nothing to be made up for. Administration expects them to be above and beyond excellent students in order to get into medical school or something like that. So they're limited to schools that are near a medical system that is capable of caring for their disability and has a reputation of being accepting or accessible, which really cuts down the number of schools that you're looking at. Loss of privacy, so like someone expecting you to explain your disability. It's not only like a FERPA and a HIPAA violation, but it's just kind of, invasive and rude. And this idea that like your doctor could become your teacher. Like you might only have one option for your doctor, and if all of a sudden, like if let's say that you needed to be hospitalized for a mental health flare-up, and your psychiatrist just so happened to be your teacher, basically your professor for your psychiatry unit in med school, or the person that you're on rotations with for that, that's a weird kind of you know more about me maybe than I want my teachers to know about me. And then the exclusion and isolation, whether that be from like inaccessibility, the lack of community, disabled community is kind of hard to come by and find, or lack of mentorship, like maybe you don't have someone who is a wheelchair user and knows how to navigate this stuff. There's not someone that you can kind of look up to and talk to. Environment, this is kind of simple, self-explanatory. It's the aspects of the physical environment that prevent equal access. So this can be not only like, oh, there's no ramp, the OR room's really crowded and cluttered. It can be stuff like, there's no interpreter or no cart services. The hospital computer system isn't set up to be accessible to people with visual impairments. Those are physical environment barriers that kind of go into this category. Stigma and ableism. If you don't know what ableism is, if you think of racism or sexism or homophobia and kind of apply that to disability, that's where this comes into play. Maybe your peers are jealous or judging you for having accommodations, like, oh, why does this person get extra time, or why don't they have to take it in the big lecture hall? Being forced to take a leave of absence for mental health or physical health struggles, or having unnecessary fitness of duty screenings, questioning whether you have a disability or what you really need. That's very, invasive and rude. And then you have like misconceptions, misbeliefs, fear of disclosure. So when you feel like you can't tell someone about your disability because you don't know how they're going to react, or you think they're going to react poorly. This is very common. You'll see it come up a lot in articles. Microaggressions and discrimination. You can Google microaggressions if you need more examples. Patronizing and infantilization. So just being treated like you are a child or not capable of doing things. Being deprived of opportunities. Maybe someone doesn't expect you to be able to do something, so they never even tell you the opportunity exists. So policy is basically the legal and guidance-based discrimination and barriers that usually aren't reflective of how modern medicine is practiced. So that or just a lack of knowledge of how policy and laws work. One of the biggest barriers is just like, can you even understand this documentation that's in front of you? Whether it be your student handbook or the technical standards that you have to sign. Technical standards are these lists of things that you sign when you matriculate into medical school that basically says, okay, by signing here, I agree that to my present knowledge, I can perform the roles of a doctor by doing these tasks. Like it has at the bottom here, organic versus functional. Organic is something like you need to be able to obtain visual information by reading an x-ray. But we know that our family physicians are not the only people who look at our x-rays, if they look at our x-rays, right? They're making sure that they're sending that stuff to a radiologist who is an expert in that area and does that. So why does a doctor who has a visual impairment have to read an x-ray in order to be a doctor? They really don't. On the flip side, you have functional. So it could be a doctor needs to be able to obtain information from a radiology report, and that would just involve reading the report. A lot of schools and people struggle with really understanding the ADA, the rights that students have, and sometimes don't even realize that they're violating those rights. There's this misuse of the argument called undue hardship, which is where you do not have to supply an accommodation, or it becomes unreasonable if it puts an undue financial burden on the people providing it, or if it fundamentally alters like the curriculum. If you look at some place like OSU, which has so much money, like the whole total school's budget, and you compare that to the cost of, let's say, putting in a wheelchair ramp costs the program, I don't know, $10,000, $5,000, $10,000, somewhere in there, random number, that is, pennies to the budget of OSU. So it's not really a hardship or an undue financial burden. And a lot of times the responsibility to report things when it goes wrong falls on the student, rather than proactive investigations or proactive measures being taken to prevent barriers from occurring, like audits of school programs. We're relying on the students to speak up and report when something is done unfairly, which would require them to know their rights, which we don't teach people about, and would require them to do something that's kind of scary, like speak up about something that your superiors are doing. That's not easy for students to do. If you have any questions, it's a lot of nuanced stuff. Just let me know. I'd be happy to, talk through it or hear your thoughts or give some guidance.